spoilers! You literally can't talk about this show without them. I am an avid Scott Pilgrim enjoyer. I've read the comics multiple times. I've seen the movie with a star-studded cast multiple times. And when I heard that Scott Pilgrim was getting an anime adaptation, with that star-studded cast, I was electric. This was the moment for Scott Pilgrim to become a moving comic, a gas anime with the potential to expand on characters and relationships, fix the shortcomings of the comics, and in turn become the magnum opus Scott Pilgrim adaptation. So when it finally came out, I was straight vibrating, dude. So full of joy, full of glee, jubilation, and more. I opened Netflix and prepared for my maiden voyage with Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. My heart broke. My disappointment could not be described. It was a rushed, sloppy retelling of a story that had already been told twice before so well. We hardly got to know Knives, Scott, Kim, or even have any time with Ramona before Matthew Patel came in to fight Scott. I prayed the fight would be well animated, and then that pit in my stomach quickly turned into an audible, "Excuse me?" as Matthew Patel punched a hole through the main character. My fears of a haphazard cash grab retelling of the Scott Pilgrim epic vanished, along with my pipe dream of the perfect comic-accurate animated expansion of the source. Instead, we received an adaptation with substantial changes. So much so, it became a completely distinct story, and I couldn't have been happier about it. But it definitely wasn't perfect. The most consistent gripe I had with the show was that the voice acting and animation weren't necessarily the best, which makes this subreddit thread really funny. Most of the cast only did live-action acting, and I'm not an actor, but I do know that live-action acting and voice acting are not necessarily the same. Unfortunately, me and that Reddit thread were kinda right. There are several moments where characters say lines that just don't match their expressions, feel underacted, or a number of cases where the voice acting is indeed solid, but it gets hampered by what seemed like the animators not understanding the tone of what the actors actually said or not animating the characters enough. I do want to say that I absolutely love this cast, and I think they did a fantastic job all around, but there's a number of scenes that just don't hit, and whether that's due to mismatched mouth flaps, bad animation, or poor delivery kind of varies, but it's never really helped by the fact that the soundscape is kind of empty. Let me show you this scene in episode 6.
Where have I seen that robot?
Starting with Ramona, her delivery on this line doesn't match her expression. In this case, I feel Winstead's performance was solid, but her expression and lack of movement make Ramona seem wooden.
It wasn't me. It was the goose.
What? Goose don't skate? Why would I build a skate ramp in the middle of Julie's lovely home?
She seems pissed. Does this mean I can't live here?
Lucas Lee, in that next bit, clearly has that confused anime tough guy expression. But Evan's delivery feels way too quiet, and so does Schwartzman's. Given Gideon or Gordon's expression, there should be way more volume and fluster to his voice. It just ends up sounding kind of like he was afraid to get too loud or he'd wake up his parents. Kind of like me recording in my mom's closet. Between people talking, there isn't any sound, and it makes it seem like nobody's in the same room.
It wasn't me. It was the goose.
Also, I want to point out the fact that nobody moves while they're not speaking. While Gideon or Gordon is yelling at Lucas Lee isn't moving at all until he starts speaking.
What? Goose don't skate? Why would I build a skate ramp in the middle of Julie's lovely home?
She seems pissed.
It really contributes to the visual void and robs this scene of some of that Scott Pilgrim charm and character that it could have had. It almost feels like a first draft, like they were at a deadline and couldn't finish it on time. We get another scene that's similarly hampered by a lack of movement in episode 2.
Scott dated her?
Ramona's face feels dead and unexpressive because it is. Her face doesn't move. It makes Winstead's performance very odd and stilted, almost like they cut it from 2 takes. My guess is that they didn't, but that pause between dated and her feels odd and unnatural because her face doesn't move with her intonation. Here's one more example from episode 8.
Me fight you over Ramona? Don't make me laugh. And I'm vegan no longer. I had a cheese plate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner today. You owe me a new tub of butter. I mean popcorn.
In this scene, Ruth nails the cartoony over-the-top vibe of Todd Ingram, but the animation makes Todd feel kind of flat, and in turn, Ruth seems as though he's overacted. Todd Ingram hardly moves, and when he does, it's slow and smooth. Wouldn't it have added to the over-the-top nature of Scott Pilgrim if Todd snapped up when he said, "I am vegan no longer," rather than slowly rising? And or put his hands up to count when he says breakfast, lunch, and dinner, rather than leaving them still at his side. It's little things like that that just add so much character that is missing. Now the haters will say I'm nitpicking, to which I say, eat my ass. Regardless of how nitpicky it seems, it was pretty noticeable throughout the whole show, which is why I pulled so many examples. I really wanted to see these zany characters in full form like we got in the movies and comics. And despite having a simple and expressive art style when still, these mismatched vocal performances and a lack of animation make a number of these scenes feel hollow and empty. Thankfully, the fights and big set pieces all look really smooth, or at the very least, visually interesting enough that I didn't notice. The absolute standout for me, at least, being Roxy versus Ramona. This fight is sick. It is emotionally charged, action-packed, and so unique that it could only occur in Scott Pilgrim. We get to see the former lovers chucking each other through various movies. From ancient Japan to a plane that's about to crash, it is an absolute treat to watch and capped off by a really touching moment that I absolutely loved, where Ramona apologizes to Roxy for leaving without giving her any closure. After the fight, they kind of become friends. That friendship doesn't exactly last. I kind of thought Roxy was going to come back for the rest of the show and kind of be like a sidekick. She didn't. She doesn't come back until like episode 8, which kind of made me sad. I always liked Matthew Patel's magic, and I'm really glad that we got an expanded fight with him this time around. Him fighting Gideon Graves for Gideon's entire empire was an absolute blast. It starts with Matthew calling all of the evil X's to Gideon's lair, and then Gideon bets everything on a fight with Matthew Patel. We get to see Matthew and Gideon smashing their way through various parts of the Empire that each utilize Matthew's abilities in different ways. Like, Matthew literally dunks on Gideon. Gideon counters them with his wealth and raw fighting strength. Wait, that kind of sounds like Batman. Anyway, the result is a beautiful tug of war between the two that leaves you guessing which X will win the fight until it's over. And that brings me to my favorite part of the whole series. The evil X's don't die. We get to see what they'd be like if Scott didn't turn them into a pile of coins. Lucas Lee was definitely my favorite, and Chris Evans, like in the movie, does a perfectly smug betrayal. He's hysterical. He gets a few moments with Ramona in his episode, but I feel like those moments do way more for him than for Ramona. While Todd Ingram has a hot and heavy affair with Wallace, that might be one of the funniest parts of the entire show.
Envy! I can't be with you anymore. I'm in love with Wallace Wells.
What?
Matthew Patel beating Gideon Graves in the previously mentioned fight allows for the hysteric antics of Gordon Goose, the pathetic reality of the G-Man after he loses the title, the G-Man. Gideon's whole arc and interactions with Lucas and Julie were hysterical, and, well, we got more Lucas, so I'm happy about that. Seeing all their interactions and experiencing them as more than just evil X's expands Scott Pilgrim and gives depth to what are otherwise just plot devices. It's really cool, and it makes already existing characters in Scott Pilgrim feel less like they were carved for a specific role in the original story and more like they're actual people with agency in the world. Scott dies and the characters don't break. They adapt and move on just like real life. Knives obviously mourns his death, but rather than be crippled by that loss like she is in the comics, she develops a strong relationship with Steven and Kim and finds a way to truly come into her own through her music. The scene between her and Kim playing felt so genuine and heartwarming, with Kim actually smiling, that I couldn't help but smile along with him. Scott Pilgrim is the title character, but everyone has enough charm and depth to carry the show on their own. Having Ramona constantly face her exes and search for Scott reinforced the amount of chemistry the two had. I mean, this Ramona literally went on one date with Scott. but she still kept pushing to find out what happened. And even though every X isn't necessarily a really cathartic release like Roxy versus Ramona was, I loved getting to see them interact because you really don't get a whole lot of that in the comics. I loved seeing more of Ramona and learning that she's apparently a kick-ass stunt woman. I initially wasn't a huge fan of the time travel plot at first, but this was like 85% because I had watched the Attack on Titan finale 2 nights prior. Seeing her future self forced her to realize that she couldn't just run away from the commitment because it's part of what created the evil X's, and in a large part, future Scott, aside from Scott being Scott. The time travel also forced Scott to face his future self and learn from what a pathetic man he could become if he doesn't work to improve, which is a really cool flip from the original. It leaves both characters with a satisfying end and the promise that they'll stay together through effort and self-examination rather than just being together. I'm still a little disappointed that they didn't address Scott dating Knives and Ramona at the same time with Ramona, but at least they addressed it with Knives. Jumping back into this misfit circle of 20-somethings after not going through a new journey with them for years warmed my soul and filled my heart. And despite some of the examples I talked about, there are plenty of scenes that really do capture the zaniness and character of everyone. It creates a truly wonderful addition to the lineup of Scott Pilgrim content. Even after watching this anime, I see this series has so much potential, and I always wondered why there wasn't more. I mean, it's so wacky and crazy, it's like ripe for spin-offs. After having my itch for Scott Pilgrim content scratched, I don't know that I want any more. Scott and Ramona's story is finished. Every adaptation has done something a little bit different and brought something new to the table. And if we were to just constantly get more Scott Pilgrim content, I feel like it would kind of lose its charm. Not everything needs to have a never-ending stream of content, and honestly, I'd be kind of disappointed if we just got yearly retellings of this story. If we were to have another adaptation, I'd really want it to do something like Scott Pilgrim Takes Off has done.